From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
The NEA's Creative Writing Fellowship program funds about 40 writers a year, an investment of $1 million annually in our nation's literary community. It's a rather extraordinary program in that it is huge. More than 1,000 writers apply each year, and it is careful. Each eligible manuscript is read by at least 3 prominent writers before any decisions are made. And the entire process is anonymous. The panelists never know the identity of the writer whose work they're reading. They are basing their recommendations on pure artistic excellence and merit. One of those fellows is the writer I'm honored to introduce. When Jeff Eugenides applied, after the publication of The Virgin Suicides, he wrote in his application, "I'm applying for an NEA fellowship in order to secure the time and freedom from financial constraints to write my second novel. I will be conducting research for the book during a trip to Turkey. An NEA fellowship would sustain me through the final composition of the novel on which I have been at work for over a year." He won a fellowship in 1995. The book was Middlesex, and it took a little longer than Jeff had anticipated, but when it came out in 2002, it blew the literary world away and went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. I remember the first time I met Jeff. I hope you remember it this way. We'll see. It was at a New Year's Eve dinner at a mutual friend's home. Rick Moody and Donald Antrim, college classmates of Jeff's, were also there. Donald had just published Elect Mr. Robinson for a Better World. The Virgin Suicides was already behind you. And who remembers what Rick was up to, he being the most prolific of the lot? At some point in the evening, the three of them started comparing size of their respective manuscripts. Rick said, "Well, you know, sometimes it's big and sometimes it's small. Now I'm working on a big one. I think it may have been Purple America." Don said, "Mine's a small one, but it packs a punch." That would have been his next book, The 100 Brothers. Jeff said, quite assuredly, "Mine's a really big one, and it's going to blow you all away." Well, your big one, Middlesex, certainly did just that. It punched a hole in the pristine veneer of the literary culture, hermaphrodites, immigration, architecture, and depictions of the dark recesses of the post-war dream. Middlesex is broad-ranging, finely wrought, a brilliant American novel. And now, with The Marriage Plot, we step onto the very turf you shared with Don and Rick at Brown University, where I imagine the manly competitions began. Providence in the 1980s is where we depart for a journey of pure youthful idealism and pretension, heavily laced with the complications of love, and so totally profound in its exploration of what we once called madness, and now has as many names as there are drugs to treat it. While it may not be as big as your last one, Jeff, I can still feel its heat. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffrey Eugenides.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ira. I don't remember saying any of that. I guess I've already become a Washingtonian. I must have misspoke. It will blow you away. I can't imagine being that hubristic, but it's great to be here today. I'm actually, it's wonderful to, I was a little worried when he started reading what my application was back then, but it brings back into my memory how important the NEA grant was at that time in my career. So I'm still grateful for that and grateful for the institution. I actually like Washington a lot. I like coming here, and for me, I know it's the seat of power, but for me, it's always been a kind of literary city. I had some literary friends here, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, and Leanne Wieseltier. So when I come down here, I always try to see them, or did try to see Christopher. and you're one of the greatest bookstores in the country, Politics and Prose, and even the presidential campaign. If you think about it, it's kind of literary this year. President Obama is a writer, a published author. He actually, when he was young, wanted to become a novelist for a while, but the constant criticism, the bad reviews that you get, not everybody can take that kind of pressure. So he decided to go and be the leader of the free world. You have to have a spine of steel for a mixed review in the New York Times Book Review. And even Mitt Romney, I think, I'm a professor of creative writing, and I think he shows a lot of talent in fiction writing. You hear about those books Salinger's been writing up in New Hampshire that are in a safe that maybe never will be published, and that famous manuscript by Walter Benjamin that he was carrying when he was escaping the Nazis. Those lost masterpieces remind me a little bit of Romney's tax returns. So I'm happy to be in such a literary city at such a literary moment. I'm going to read a little bit of The Marriage Plot, and the book came out a year ago, and I spent a fair amount of time reading from it. And there's a nice passage at the beginning of the book that's funny and tasty and is usually good for public readings. And it would be great if I could read that, but I'm so tired of reading that section that I'm afraid I'm going to read a passage further on in the book, which is rather depressing and about mental illness. But I hope you'll be able to understand that I'm doing it because I need some freshness to the paperback tour. It's nice to be on the paperback tour and not the hardback tour, and I wanted to do something different. And I'll just tell you a little bit. In this section, the character of Leonard. Oh, I forgot. I have these on. I'm sorry. It's ridiculous. I was one of those people who wear sunglasses at the podium. How awful. I really apologize. I can't believe that. My God. I just went to the ophthalmologist, and she told me that I have very thin eyes and I should always wear sunglasses, which I've never done in my entire life, so I'm obviously overdoing the corrective. Leonard suffers from manic depression. This book happens in the 80s, so they didn't call it bipolar, they called it manic depression. And in this episode that I'm going to read, he's going into a manic state. So you need to know a little bit about what happens when someone is in mania. Basically what happens to you is that you start feeling omnipotent. You feel incredibly powerful, as though you can do anything. Your mind is very quick. You're full of energy. You're usually hypersexual at that time, and you talk a lot. Sometimes people don't make a lot of sense. They begin to make puns on language. In a sense, language begins to overheat in their brains, and they start talking oddly. And you also get quite often attached to strange articles of clothing. In this section, Leonard is obsessed with this winter fur hat that he's wearing. At different parts of the book, he gets very attached to a hunter's vest, different things like that. His girlfriend Madeline is unaware that these things are happening, and he's just starting to go a little bit crazy. So that's what's happening in this section. You'll also have to imagine that this is on Cape Cod in the wintertime, which is extremely different than D.C. in the Indian summer. If you can still say Indian summer, or is it good? Native American summer doesn't sound good to me. I'm having trouble with all those kinds of things. Like, I'm old enough that Bombay was Bombay, not Mumbai, and I got used to Mumbai. And then Salman Rushdie's book came out this week, and they said he was born in Bombay. So I think maybe you still say Bombay if it's the past. And then I was ordering a martini, and I thought, should I order a Mumbai martini or a Bombay martini? So I got Tanqueray because I was so anxious. Okay, here we go. And then I'll be happy to take questions. The problem with being Superman was that everybody else was so slow. Even at a place like Pilgrim Lake, where everyone had high IQs, The pauses in people's speech were long enough for Leonard to drop off his laundry and return before they finished their sentences. So he finished their sentences for them, to save everyone time. If you paid attention, it was amazingly easy to predict the predicate of a sentence from its subject. Only a few conversational gambits seemed to occur to most people. They didn't like it when you finished their sentences, however, or they liked it at first. At first, they thought it indicated a mutual understanding between the two of you. But if you did it repeatedly, they became annoyed, which was fine, since it meant you didn't have to waste time talking to them anymore. This was harder on the person you lived with. Madeline had been complaining about how impatient Leonard was. His tremor may have been gone, but he was always tapping his foot. Finally, just that afternoon, while helping Madeline study for the GRE, Leonard, unhappy with the pace at which Madeline was diagramming a logic problem, had grabbed the pen out of her hand. "This isn't art class," he said. "Thank you. These are causing me lots of trouble today." Uh-oh. You all right? Okay, thank you. "This isn't art class," he said. "You'll run out of time if you do it so slow. Come on." He drew the diagram in about 5 seconds before sitting back and folding his hands over his chest with a satisfied air. "Give me my pen," Madeline said, snatching it back. "I'm just showing you how to do it." "Will you please get out of here?" Madeline cried. "You're being so annoying." And so it was that Leonard found himself, a few minutes later, vacating the unit in order to let Madeline study. He decided to walk into Provincetown and lose more weight. Despite the cold, he wore only a sweater, gloves, and his new winter hat, a fur hunting cap with ear flaps that tied together. The winter sky was blue as he made his way out of the laboratory grounds and along Shore Road. The surrounding dunes looked comparatively tall, speckled with clumps of dune grass, except for stretches of white sand near the top where the wind kept anything from growing. Being alone increased the volume of information bombarding him. There was no one around to distract him from it. As Leonard strode along, thoughts stacked up in his head like air traffic over Logan Airport to the northwest. There were 1 or 2 jumbo jets full of big ideas, a fleet of 707s laden with the cargo of sensual impressions, the color of the sky, the smell of the sea, as well as Learjets carrying rich, solitary impulses that wished to travel incognito. All these planes requested permission to land simultaneously. From the control tower in his head, Leonard radioed the aircraft, telling some to keep circling while ordering others to divert to another location entirely. The stream of traffic was never ending, the task of coordinating their arrivals constant from the minute Leonard woke up to the minute he went to sleep. But he was an old pro by now, after 2 weeks at Sweet Spot International. Tracking developments on his radar screen, Leonard could bring each plane in on schedule while trading a salty remark with the controller in the next seat and eating a sandwich, making everything look easy, all part of the job. The colder you were, the more calories you burned. His ebullient mood, the steady pumping of his heart, and the big, soft fur hat were enough to keep Leonard warm as he walked along, passing the big houses on the water and the shingled cottages cramming the little lanes. But when he finally arrived in the center of town, he was surprised to see how deserted it was, even on a weekend. Stores and restaurants had started closing up after Labor Day. Now, 2 weeks before Christmas, only a few were still operating. The Lobster Pot had closed, Nappy's was open, Front Street was open, the Crown and Anchor had closed. He was gratified, therefore, to find a small midday crowd gathered in the Governor Bradford. Climbing on his stool, he looked up at the television, trying to seem like a person with one thought in his head instead of 50. When the bartender came over, Leonard said, "Are you Governor Bradford?" "Not me." "I'd like a pint of Guinness, please," Leonard said, swiveling on his stool and glancing at the other customers. His head was getting hot, but he didn't want to take off his hat. Of the 4 females in the bar, 3 were engaged in self-grooming. I forgot to mention that Leonard is a biologist, and a lot of the observations he's making in this passage have to do with his various evolutionary biological surmises. Of the 4 females in the bar, 3 were engaged in self-grooming. running their hands through their hair to indicate their readiness for copulation. The males responded by lowering their voices and sometimes pawing the females. If you ignored human qualities like speech and clothing, the primate behaviors became more apparent. When his Guinness arrived, Leonard swiveled back around to drink it. "You need to refine your shamrock technique," he said, gazing down into the glass. "Excuse me?" Leonard pointed at the foamy head. "This doesn't look like a shamrock. It looks like a figure eight." "You a bartender?" "No." "Then it's not your business, I guess." Leonard grinned. He said, "Cheers," and began sucking down the creamy stout. Part of him wanted to stay in the bar the rest of the afternoon. He wanted to watch football and drink beer. He wanted to watch the human females groom themselves and see what other primate behaviors they exhibited. He, too, was a primate, of course, in the present context, a rogue male. Rogue males stirred up all kinds of trouble. It might be fun to see what he could get going. But he was getting a bad vibe from the bartender, and he felt like walking some more. And so when he finished his drink, he pulled a $10 bill out of his jeans and left it on the bar. Without waiting for change, he vaulted off the stool and plunged out into the bone-chilling air. The sky had already begun to grow dark. It was only a little after 2, and already the day was dying. Staring up, Leonard felt his spirits sink with it. His earlier mental liveliness was beginning to fade. It had been a mistake to drink the Guinness. Thrusting his hands into the pockets of his jeans, Leonard rocked back and forth on his heels, and that was all it took. In further confirmation of his brilliant move, no sooner did his energy sag than he felt it being replenished, as though tiny valves in his arteries were spritzing out the elixir of life. Buoyed by his brain chemistry, he sauntered farther along Commercial Street. Up ahead, a guy in a leather cap and jacket was going down the steps to the vault. The throbbing music inside escaped into the street until he closed the door after him. Homosexuality was an interesting topic from a Darwinian standpoint. A trait predisposing a population towards sterile sexual relations should have resulted in the disappearance of that trait. But the boys in the vault were evidence otherwise. It must be an autosomal transmission of some kind, the associated genes hitching rides on sisterly chromosomes. Leonard proceeded on. He looked at the driftwood sculptures in the shuttered art galleries and the homoerotic postcards in the windows of a stationery store still open. Right then, he noticed a surprising thing. Across the street, a saltwater taffy shop appeared to be open. The neon sign was lit in the window, and he could see a figure moving around inside. Something mysterious but insistent, something that called to his own primate nature, prompted him to draw nearer. He entered the shop, activating a bell on the door. The thing of interest that his cells had been telling him about turned out to be a teenage girl working behind the counter. She had red hair, high cheekbones, and a tight yellow sweater. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I have a question. Is it still whale watching season?" I don't know. But they have whale watching boats here, don't they?" "I think that's more like in the summer." "Aha," Leonard said, not knowing what to say next. He was acutely aware of how small and perfect the girl's body was. At the same time, the sugary smell of the shop reminded him of a candy store he used to go into as a kid with no money to buy anything. Now he pretended to be interested in the taffy on the shelves, crossing his arms behind his back and browsing. "I like your hat," the girl said. Leonard turned and smiled broadly. "You do? Thanks. I just got it. Aren't you cold without a coat, though?" "Not in here with you," Leonard said. His sensors registered an uptick in wariness on her part, so he quickly added, "How come you're open in winter?" This proved to be a good move. It gave the girl a chance to vent. "Because my father wants to ruin my whole weekend," she said. "Your dad owns this place?" "Yeah." "So you're like the taffy heiress?" "I guess," said the girl. "You know what you should tell your dad? You should tell him it's December. Nobody wants saltwater taffy in December." "That's what I do tell him. He says people still drive up for the weekend, so we should stay open." "How many customers have come in today?" "Like 3, and now you." Do you consider me a customer? She shifted her weight to one hip, growing skeptical. Well, you're in here. I am definitely in here, Leonard said. What's your name? She hesitated. Heidi. Hi, Heidi. Maybe it was her blush, or the tight fit of her sweater, or it was just part of being a superman within reach of a supergirl. But for whatever reason, Leonard felt himself getting hard at 5 paces. This was a piece of significant clinical data. He wished he had his moleskin notebook with him to write it down. Heidi, Leonard said. Hi, Heidi. Hello, she said. Hi, Heidi, Leonard repeated. Heidi-ho, the Heidi-ho man. Have you ever heard of the Heidi-ho man, Heidi? Cab Calloway, famous jazz musician. The Heidi-ho man, I'm not sure why they called him that. Hi-ho Silver, Hawaii 5-0. Her brow wrinkled. Leonard saw that he was losing her, and so said, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Heidi. Tell me one thing, though. Do you make the saltwater taffy right here? In the summer we do, not now. And do you use salt water from the ocean? Huh? He approached the counter, close enough to press his boner against the glass front. What's the sign for boner? Thank you. I know sign language much better than I realized. Very, very good. He approached the counter, close enough to press his against the glass front. I just always wondered why they call it saltwater taffy. Like, do you use salt and water, or do you have to use salt water? Heidi took a step back from the counter. I've got to do some stuff in the back, she said, so if you want anything. For some reason, Leonard bowed. Go to it, he said. I don't mean to keep you from your labors. It's been nice meeting you, Heidi. How old are you? 16. Do you have a boyfriend? She didn't seem to want to say. Yes. He's a lucky guy. He should be in here right now, keeping you company. My dad'll be here in a minute. I'm sorry I won't be able to meet him, Leonard said, pressing against the counter. I could tell him to stop ruining your weekends. Before I go, though, I think I'll buy some taffy. Again he perused the racks. When he bent forward, his hat fell off, and he caught it. Perfect reflexes, like Fred Astaire. He could flip it in the air, end over end, right onto his head if he wanted to. Saltwater taffy is always pastel, he commented. Why is that? This time Heidi didn't respond at all. You know what I think it is, Heidi? I think pastels are the palette of the seashore. I'll take these pastel green ones, which are the color of dune grass, and I'll take some pink ones, which are like the sun setting on the water, and I'll take these white ones, which are like sea foam, and these yellow ones, which are like the sun on the sand. He brought all 4 bags to the counter, then decided to take a few other flavors, buttercream, chocolate, strawberry, 7 bags in all. You want all these? Heidi said, incredulous. Why not? I don't know. It's just a lot. I like a lot, Leonard said. She rang up his purchase. Leonard reached into his pocket and took out his cash. Keep the change, Leonard said, but I'll need a bag to carry all this in. I don't have a bag big enough for all this unless you want a trash bag. A trash bag is perfect, Leonard said. Heidi disappeared into the back of the shop. She came out with a dark green 25-gallon heavy-duty trash bag and began putting the bags of taffy in it. She had to bend forward in order to do so. Leonard stared at her breasts in the tight sweater. He knew exactly what to do. He waited until she lifted the trash bag over the counter. Then, taking it from her, he said, "You know what? Since your dad's not here," and holding her wrists, he leaned forward and kissed her. Not long, not deeply, just a peck on her lips, surprising her totally. Her eyes grew wide. "Merry Christmas, Heidi," he said. "Merry Christmas." And he whirled out the door into the street. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I will take questions. I don't know if there's a microphone or if I repeat them, but there's a microphone or not, I don't know. Yes. Ah, there it is. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
So The Virgin Suicide is my favorite book, and I've read it dozens of times. And I was wondering what inspired you to write that story, like, because it seems so personal.
The Virgin Suicides?
Yeah.
I actually got that idea from an actual babysitter who was working for my brother and babysitting my niece and nephew. And I only met her once, and just chatting with her, and she told me that she and all her sisters had tried to commit suicide. And I was obviously astonished by that, and I asked her why. And she said, I don't know, we had a lot of pressure. So that idea rattled around in my head for a year or two. And then at some point I had this idea of telling a story like that from the point of view of a communal narrator, the we, the first person plural that I use. And once I had the voice and this narrative, this idea, I began to write the book. I think sometimes you just respond to an impulse that seems innately dramatic to you. You don't really know why you're writing it psychologically, and then later on, maybe sometimes after years pass, you realize what the real impulse was. And in this case, I've come to believe, and I think I'm right about it, is that what I was really writing about with the Virgin Suicides was the experience of growing up in Detroit. Because when I was born, the city was still a vibrant city. It was about the fourth largest in the country. And over the time I was growing up, the riots happened, and there was a lot of depopulation, and the city lost its tax base and began to fall apart. And so, growing up in a city like that, you see entropy at first hand, and you think entropy is the natural state of things. It seemed to me that everything that was created was falling apart, and this was the way of the world. So there was a kind of melancholy and a kind of elegy to growing up in Detroit, and I think that's really why I chose to write about these five sisters in a town that's dying and in a house that's dying, and they are also suicidal. Even though the book is not specifically about Detroit, it doesn't name Detroit or Grosse Pointe. I was obviously drawing on memories of a embattled American industrial town.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what brought you to this book, this current book you have, after the big success of Middlesex? Was that daunting at all in beginning a new project, and what brought you to this book?
I actually, while I was writing Middlesex, one of the reasons it took me longer than the year I said it would take, see, if I had said it was going to take 8 years, I never would have gotten that grant. But I was having so much trouble with Middlesex, I stopped writing it. And I started writing another book. It's quite, this book it's called The Marriage Plot, and it's kind of fitting in a way because it began as an act of literary adultery, because I was married to Middlesex, and Middlesex was giving me a lot of trouble, and I was having a difficult time with my relationship. And I met this little tiny idea one day, and I thought, this will be an easy novel to write. I'm just going to forget about Middlesex and go off with this little new idea. And then, of course, that became just as difficult and demanding as my marriage. And then I realized that I really missed Middlesex, and that I felt there was a way for us to get back together and work things out. So I went back and finished Middlesex. And when I was done with that and it came out, I already had this other, maybe a quarter novel waiting for me. So I thought I would be able to dispatch it quickly. And I worked for a couple more years on that until I realized something was rotten in the state of that book. And in that manuscript, which I won't tell you about, there were three characters, Madeline, Leonard, and Mitchell. And they interested me. Madeline's predicament particularly interested me. And as I wrote about her, I began to realize that I had put her in the wrong book, that the story I wanted to write was really about these three characters. So I had to take them out of that manuscript and put that novel, which was at 150 pages or so, into a drawer where it still stays and will never emerge, I think. So that's how it came about. I wrote a sentence one day. Usually I write, and then finally I find a sentence that seems to be the first sentence of the book. And something about that sentence tells me how to narrate the book and what it's about. So in this book, it's not the first sentence of the book. It's a sentence on page 19, which is Madeline's love troubles had begun at the time when the French theory she was reading deconstructed the very notion of love. There was this idea of a young woman who had read a ton of Austen, a ton of Henry James, and had become, as a result, full of romantic yearning and illusion. And as she grows up and becomes more aware and more intelligent, she wants to cure herself of that kind of romanticism. So she takes a very rigorous course in literary theory that should deconstruct literary theory and also deconstruct love in her head. But as she's doing this and trying no longer to be a sap for love, she falls in love with the guy in the same class. It was that irony that started this book. And at that point, I had no idea what the book would be about. I didn't know it was going to be called The Marriage Plot. I didn't know actually that this woman was going to be writing a thesis on the marriage plot, and I didn't know one of the characters would go to India and have a spiritual search. All these things came later, but that's how the impulse started. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for being here. Sofia Coppola did a really beautiful adaptation of The Virgin Suicides, and I was wondering what that experience was like for you, and if you would consider having Middlesex or The Marriage Plot translated into film.
Well, the experience was one of no violation, and which is not all. Sophia really liked the book, and she wanted to translate the book to film. So she didn't change anything radically. The fact of taking a book and making it a film, however, does change things radically. There's nothing you can, there's no way around it. So the experience was both. It was kind of uncanny because when I first watched the film, it was very recognizable, obviously, because many of the lines that the characters speak are lines that I wrote. The town, wasn't exactly how I imagined it, but basically it was my memories. And yet at the same time, everything was radically altered. The narration in the book is from the boys. The girls are seen in the distance. But in the movie, the girls are, living and breathing human beings, and so they take us, they have a solidity in the movie that they don't have in the book. So the point of view sort of shifts from the boys to the girls in the movie. And when I watch it, that's usually how I feel, both recognizing it and being slightly estranged from it. Middlesex is a difficult one to make a movie out of because it would be about 7 hours long probably. They wanted to do a mini-series on HBO, and there's a script written. And that, like my novel, is sitting in someone's drawer in Los Angeles. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. And The Marriage Plot, I'm actually co-writing the screenplay for. I'm just starting to do that. So that it seems like a book that could be, of my books, it seems the most adaptable in that way. So we will see. It's once I think about it, it's so difficult to. And movies are so different than books. If you in a novel, you can go back and say 3 years before and tell a whole long scene of 20 pages. You don't have time for that in a movie, and you have to find all these shortcuts. So what I think you want in a film of your book, no matter who makes it, is for someone to find a cinematic equivalent of your book, not to be so faithful to it that in fact it becomes a plotting mess. You need to take some very, very strong and radical moves because the visual medium is so different. So I'm not expecting, even if I'm in charge, I will probably violate the book quite terribly. It'd also be more interesting to write it that way, I think.
Hi. So Middlesex is my favorite book right now, and part of why I love it so much is because it's from this very personal point of view of someone who you don't really hear from all that often. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about what it was like kind of writing the character of Cal / Calliope and kind of going into what the response has been also from people who are transgender or intersex.
Well, it was the reason Middlesex took me a long time was trying to get the voice for the book. And I tried to write it in the first person. I tried to write it in the third person. And each of these voices was inadequate to the story I was trying to tell. I always knew that I wanted it to be an intimate story, told from the inside. I wanted to remain very close to the experience of someone going through a radical transformation like that. I also wanted to avoid the pronomial problem of having a novel where the pronoun is she up until page 250, and then it's he, or S/HE. I didn't want. So I allowed me a way out of that. And also the premise of the book is that we are all an I before we are a he or a she. We're, individual identity trumps our gendered identity. So I wanted the I, but as I tried to write this story, which is historical in many parts and has to tell the stories of people before Cal was born, the first person narration wasn't adequate to do that. I could not convey people's thoughts, and the book wasn't working. So I finally combined a first person voice that has the ability to go into third person. So it's a cardinal rule of fiction writing that you're not supposed to do that. But fortunately my teachers weren't around when I was doing it, so I just mashed them together, and then I explained it to myself as follows. I think that if you had a genetic condition, as Cal does, that so fundamentally changed your life, your need to understand why this happened to you, and to try to figure out historically and generationally why you are the person you are, it might cause you imaginatively and psychologically to break the bounds of your own ego and go outside of yourself, at least to try to figure out what happened. So I think that Cal is inventing his story and inventing his past, but he's not lying about it. He's telling it as accurate as he can, but he's obviously narrating events that he couldn't know by himself. So those were the difficulties. I've had lots of different reactions to the book. The most recent and the most moving for me was on the tour last year. Someone came up and gave me a letter, and he had actually 5-alpha reductase deficiency syndrome, which is the condition that Cal has. It's extremely rare, and I've actually never met anyone with it. It's one of the rare kinds of intersex conditions. And his letter said that he thanked me for writing the book, that it had saved his life in high school, but that he was also angry at me because he felt it was his story and that he wanted to write it. So it was a kind of complex letter. And I never spoke to him. He just came along in the signing line and left the letter and went off. But I was obviously moved by that. Sure.
Your books have this ability to kind of get inside the minds of characters with special circumstances or different disabilities. I'm curious about the bipolar specifically. What personal experience do you have with bipolar? Is anyone you know, or what kind of experience do you have with that personally?
Not a lot, actually. I was at a cocktail party one time, and I was talking to a woman. I'm always getting ideas from talking to people at parties or in the living room, and she said that she was bipolar, and sometimes she didn't take all of her medicine because it would push her up into a kind of more manic state, and she liked being that way. And that was just an interesting idea to me, the idea that you have a mental illness that in some ways is the best part of you. I mean, that's the difficulty. Most mental illnesses people want to get rid of, but manic depression, people don't want to get rid of the mania, at least the sweet part of it. So it's almost like being naturally addicted to a substance that you have to wean yourself. So that kind of torment appealed to me to write about, though I didn't know anyone well who had the condition. And then I had to learn a little bit about it and imagine how it would work. But that's how I went about it. And it's completely, interestingly, like the chapter about Leonard that I just read from, Brilliant Move, is the furthest from my life, but I wrote it the quickest, and it was the easiest to write in a strange way, whereas some of the book, which really draws on autobiography, I found extremely difficult to write. So I guess that's why I prefer fiction to nonfiction. But, yes?
Hi, I love the marriage plot.
Thank you.
You just referred to autobiography, and I'm wondering, why did you choose to set that story at Brown in the early 80s? Which is obviously so close to what you experienced. And by the way, I think you and I were in semiotics class together.
Oh, really? Well, I tried to set it somewhere else, a different college. And then I thought, who am I kidding? Change the name of the hall, change the street. It wasn't really adding anything, and also it was increasing my difficulties, which were numerous, because I had to then know another college as well as I knew Brown. So I thought, I've got enough trouble. I'm just putting it at Brown. I know Brown. Not obviously semiotics was very popular at Brown. It was a reasonable place to choose. But that's all. It was just making things easier for myself, more or less.
Actually, I saw the movie of the Virgin Suicides before I ever read the book. And
Did that ruin reading the book? Like, do you see Kirsten Dunst the whole time when you're reading?
Yes, I do
See?
Actually.
Yeah.
That does do that.
Yeah.
But I actually was really taken aback when I saw that a man had written it. Because from the movie, I just assumed that a woman had written it. And I think it's so interesting that in all of your books, you kind of do play around with gender, like, with the transgender and Middlesex, and then you're able to write a book in the marriage plot a lot from the perspective of a woman who's fighting her urge to love and then to get over love at the same time. And I was just kind of wondering, and I guess you kind of answered this before where you say that you're an I before you're a he or a she, but what kind of, I'd love for you to expand on that and say like what you think, just define that idea of an I. Because I think that is like the one theme that is throughout all three books.
Well, I certainly write all my female characters as I's and not as she's. I never think this is a woman and so she's going to act a certain way because she's a woman. I think I'm writing about a particular woman or a particular man, and then I figure out, what family they came from and try to remember people who might fit into that category. So I'm always writing just specifically in anything. It surprises me that people think The Virgin Suicides elucidates female experience, because the book is so obviously written by, teenage boys, hormonal teenage boys who are trying to understand the girls and don't understand them. And somehow the intensity of their curiosity and the intensity of their gaze on these girls makes it feel as though the book tells you about the girls, when I think it actually doesn't. But with my other books, and especially with the marriage plot, I was obviously going directly, trying to have a direct presentation of a female character, her mind, her thoughts. And I usually do that by giving the character a lot of my own thoughts and feelings. Madeline is obsessed with the Roland Barthes book, A Lover's Discourse, in the book. And I also found that book wonderful. So the way she reads it, the romantic feelings that she gets despite the fact that the book is trying to anatomize love, that is really me and not Madeline. So I just put it into her mind. That's how I go about it.
I just read the Virgin Suicides with the book club I'm in. I was wondering if you could give us a topic of discussion to get some mileage out of.
Topic of discussion, eh? Well, the book club, I would say it would be where is the wine and where is the beer? That's what I think book clubs are about. Well, I think this is a good one. To what extent is the female experience conveyed or conjured by a narrator who knows nothing about what he's talking about? I think that's what I would talk about.
Also, were there any possible deaths for the Lisbon girls that you were toying with but did not use?
No, I don't remember any more spectacular deaths than the ones that I came up with. The problem with that book was I say on the first page that 5 suicides will occur, so the reader knows this is going to happen. How do you surprise the reader when you've already told the reader exactly what's going to happen? And at first, I was having a suicide happen every chapter, and it became incredibly monotonous. And I realized I couldn't do that, so I changed it, and I have Cecilia commit suicide in the first chapter, and then the rest of the girls don't for a long period of the book. And as you're reading it, you're wondering, well, how are they going to, how are the 5 going to happen? And I found a way to have a surprise, even though I've already divulged the narrative.
Thanks.
Sure. Hi.
Hi. A lot of your books deal with things that most people are afraid to talk about in conversation and just in society. Do you have any advice for people who'd like to write or just bring up in conversation topics like that?
You just as a writer, you just have to not have self-censorship, I think. Nadine Gordimer said something to Christopher Hitchens once, that you have to try to write posthumously. That you should, as you write, you shouldn't worry about commerce, fashion, self-censorship, and according with public or intellectual opinion. So if you can pretend that you're dead, then what you say doesn't seem so likely to cause a fuss. So that's how I think about it. When when Kafka was dying, and I'm going to end with this, I think, because I just got the... When Kafka was dying, he got tuberculosis, and he said, I have tuberculosis, I'm dying, and I have not bought off myself with my writing. I have died my whole life, and now I will really die. And I thought that was an amazing way to describe what it's like to be a writer, in a sense, to die your whole life, because you have to remove yourself from the world to a certain extent in order to see it. You have to try to write posthumously. At the same time, though, you have to stay vitally connected to the world so that you're able to describe it. But that sense of being already dead, as the mystics advise people, and to think about the end of your life as you're living it, helps not only in people's conduct in their lives, but also, I think, in the writing of novels. So thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.